Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on where in the world you might be right now. And welcome to another episode of Global Crisis. Global Solidarity, hosted by the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung and streaming live from our headquarters in Berlin. We're on the air every first and third Wednesday of the month, welcoming thinkers, activists, and partners of the foundation to develop a better understanding of local, regional, and global aspects of the world economic and social crisis, as well as talking about what kinds of strategies an internationalist left, a socialist internationalist left, needs to pursue to turn things around. My name is Lauren Bellhorn. Joining me as usual is Fida Al-Zanin. If you'd like to join or be a part of today's conversation, feel free to drop us a line in the YouTube chat box or on Facebook, and we'll do our best to include as many questions and comments as we can. Today we're, as you can probably imagine, talking about the presidential election going on in the United States between incumbent President Donald J. Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden. Although the polls closed in most states somewhere between 12 and 15 hours ago, we still don't actually know who the winner is. There are still millions of ballots left to be counted in plenty of states. Although President Trump has already declared himself the winner about 6-7 hours ago, also claiming that he would like to take his case to the Supreme Court in order to stop the counting. But as it stands, there are still millions of ballots left to be counted. It's a very close race, and although Joe Biden probably has a solid hold on the majority of votes cast, as we know, this is the United States, democracy that doesn't function in a particularly democratic way, and so winning the majority of votes doesn't necessarily mean he's going to win the election. But no matter who ends up winning the election, one thing is for sure, namely that Trump did a lot better than pollsters and the general public probably expected. His base remains enthusiastic, and contrary to expectations, it looks like it may have even grown a little bit. The notion that there isn't a large enough base for his politics in the American electorate anymore has been disproven. At the same time, there have been some pretty encouraging victories for those of us who see ourselves on the left, such as the re-election of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, as well as Ilhan Omar, and the election of some new Democratic Socialists like Cori Bush from St. Louis. What all that means is that the results so far have been pretty mixed, and the path forward towards building some kind of progressive majority, let alone a progressive government in the United States, remains hard to discern. Even if we won't know who won for days or maybe even weeks, I'm excited to welcome two guests today to talk to us more about what we can make of the election so far and what we can expect in the next weeks, months, and even years. Our first guest is Ethan Earle. He's currently based in Paris, but he's a member of the Democratic Socialists of America's International Committee and is also a longtime colleague of ours here at the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung. He used to work in our organization's New York office and currently is a coordinator of the Strike Schools program, which we recently wrapped up, which is an international online-based training for trade union activists and organizers. We're also joined by Nicole Muller-Gonzalez, who's also a member of the DSA's International Committee, as well as the co-chair of her DSA branch in Syracuse, New York, where she's based. I want to kick things off with a pretty simple question. I'm going to hand this one over to Nicole. Nicole, you're in the United States right now. Obviously, the election did not go the way many people on our side were expecting. What is the mood, both in the city, but also among people on the left more generally?
So I would say we're all very anxious. I didn't sleep so well, and I guess all the comrades here in where I'm based probably have experiencing the same. We did obviously expect that Trump would win the large majority of the votes. We were, however, expecting at least Biden to, we're not sure yet, but it's very tight. And we are prepared, at least my chapter today and others in New York that I know of are prepared to go to the streets today in the afternoon at 5 p.m. That's something also the National Organization of USA has called for, to go to the streets to defend the votes and to defend the counting of all the votes, which is something that we are also, it seems weird maybe in Germany, but yeah, we have to, we have to fight for all the votes to be counted for. So that's basically what we are focusing right now. We want to go today at 5 p.m. We're going to go to the streets, and yeah, that's the mood.
Ethan, maybe we can throw you what's obviously the question on everybody's mind. What happened? It seems like everybody, myself included, did not manage to learn from 2016, and again expected Donald Trump to get trounced. But if we look at, expert pollsters like 538.com, New York Times, but really any polling institution in the United States, everyone was giving Biden about a 90% chance of winning. And it seemed like there was a consensus that Trump would definitely, at the very least, do worse than last time, that his overall support had gone down, that particularly the devastating impact of the coronavirus in the United States had cut away or chipped away at his support, and that although he could maybe still win in the Electoral College, there was no way that it would be as close as it actually is. So what happened?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, for anybody who has been sitting under a rock and not just been scrolling constantly their computer or their smartphone all day, right now we have Biden on either 227 or 238 total votes to Trump's 213. There are 6 major states which are still in play. They're Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. And without getting too deeply into details, there are more paths to victory, electorally speaking, for Biden at this moment. And the underlying data that is available to us at this moment would suggest it being more likely that Biden does actually pull this out. And there's a big asterisk there that I'll get back to in a minute. But I will say that as of right now, the field does look slightly more favorable to Joe Biden. In terms of what we did and didn't expect, I would say that from a left perspective, from a DSA perspective, there were a lot of folks in the organization that were trying to sound the alarms and saying, okay, we see our national polling data would lead us to believe that this is safe. But if we look at the state-to-state data, it suddenly becomes closer. If we look at some of the data underlying that state data, it becomes even closer, even sketchier. And when we do a bit of political analysis, when we look at what it means to run a sort of an anti-campaign, which is what Biden essentially did. He wasn't telling us what he was.
What do you mean by an anti-campaign?
This was a campaign that wasn't based so much around what Biden would do going forward as what he would bring us back. He would bring us back to a sense of normalcy and perhaps even nostalgia for this fonder moment in the United States that actually it doesn't conjure such fond memories for a whole lot of people living in the United States today. So I think that, and then on top of this, of course, there were the coronavirus implications for the campaign, but we had a guy who was basically cloistered in his basement during the lead up, who did everything he could to shackle Bernie Sanders and to shackle the left wing of United States politics, which was where the momentum and the enthusiasm was, and ran essentially saying, well, I'm not Trump. I'm more decent than Trump, and we can be more decent than this. And so I think running a campaign like that, we saw that didn't work in 2016. And so there was a lot of concern on the left, in any case, that it wasn't going to work again in 2020. And of course, we had folks in the establishment who were telling us why it would be different this time, because Biden wasn't Hillary, and Hillary was so uniquely unlikable, or because now we had a chance to see Trump in action. But I think we once again saw that they were largely speaking to themselves and to their extended political and class community, essentially. Yeah.
But I mean, I realize you're not a psychologist. I'm not a psychologist. And sometimes I think you might need to be a psychologist to explain what's happening in the United States right now. But why do you think that, why did Trump's base, how could it not shrink at all? How could 230,000 coronavirus deaths, the biggest economic crisis, the highest unemployment numbers since the Great Depression, how could that not even make a dent?
Yeah, you know, I think that that has more to do with what he's up against than with what he represents. I do not think that at this moment the Democratic Party is offering a credible political alternative. They are not offering, they're not telling people how they will make things better. Instead, we get a lot of nostalgia. We get a lot of moralizing. We get a lot of moral or emotional blackmail. You have to vote for the Democrats. It's the only responsible thing to do. If not, you're not a good person. And we get very little in the way of actually substantive policy proposals about how to change the lives of working people who are suffering. One thing that I think is just one little thing from this election, one of the big victories at the state level was the passage, a seeming passage of a $15 per hour minimum wage in Florida, which required a supermajority. It required more than 60% of the vote. This passed. DSA supported this. It was fantastic that it passed. And at the same time, Trump won Florida, right? So this means that there were a sizable percentage of people in that state, hundreds of thousands of people in that state, who voted both in favor of raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour and for Trump. These are people who effectively, at the end of the day, do believe that a Trump victory is better for their working class interests. This represents a massive, massive, massive failure by the Democratic Party. So I would say that that's a one, at least really big piece of how Trump was able to hold up and even expand his coalition in some ways, it seems, during the cycle.
Can I just add something to that? Can I just, so I do think that, well, what Ethan said, obviously I agree that Biden's campaign has been very uninspiring and certainly has not been based on what Bernie represented, which were all the campaigns that I would say most Americans are for example, Medicare for All, and among the young people, the Green New Deal. And he said that he's not going to, pass any of those. So he's basically just saying we're going to remain in the status quo or before Trump came to election. And an interesting poll that I saw yesterday was in, I don't know if you guys saw it, but it was in Fox News where, well, I didn't watch Fox News, but I saw the print, and it said that they were asking the people that were watching the program, like if they were in favor of, a government-led healthcare system. And around 70% of the people that were watching Fox News at that time said, yeah, they would be in favor. So you can see even amongst the voters for Trump, who would probably vote for Trump, they are, I would say, they would be in favor also of campaigns that actually are more, the flag of the left. Yeah.
Yeah, and if I can just add very quickly, because you put forward this notion of us not being psychologists, which I think was opening up a space to be armchair psychologists for a moment. I think that we are in a very nihilistic moment politically in the United States. I think that the coronavirus and the response to it had increased that nihilism. And I think that for the vote for Trump, it was in part, you have segments, right? You have irredeemable racists who make up a big part of his voting base. You have uber capitalists that just want those tax cuts that make up a big part of his base. But then you have a lot of folks that just don't feel like anything makes any difference to them. And this is the nihilistic vote. If you don't think that any of this makes any difference, then maybe from your nihilistic perspective, Trump and his reality TV show form of doing politics might just seem like more fun to you than Biden's sort of very serious finger wagging a way of doing politics. So that's my little piece of armchair psychology, which I don't think explains everything, but I think explains sort of a portion of that vote.
Yeah, that's kind of exactly what I was getting at when I made the psychology joke, because I think, regardless of who wins, and like you said, it does look like Biden is going to scrape by with a very slight victory, but regardless of who wins, there's obviously going to be, I think there's going to be, among the media elite and among political elites on both sides of the aisle, there's going to be a battle of interpretation over what was responsible for Trump's particularly strong showing and Biden's relatively weak showing. And I saw this morning that Arnie Duncan For those who don't remember, Arne Duncan was the Secretary of Education under Barack Obama and pushed through what was essentially radicalization and deepening of the privatization plans initially put forward by George W. Bush. So obviously a man who's done a lot to promote left-wing and social democratic ideas in the American public sphere. But Arne Duncan put forward a line this morning on Twitter saying that the question that we really need to start talking about is not red versus blue, but rather whiteness. And that's the key way to, or the key factor in explaining the election. And I mean, obviously, like you pointed out, Ethan, there are plenty of irredeemable racists in the United States, and a lot of them are probably in the Trump coalition. But to the extent that exit poll data can really be trusted, and obviously we'll have clearer numbers in a couple of weeks, but at least the exit poll data coming out this morning indicates that although a large portion of Trump's base remains rightward-leaning white men, he actually did better among women and among voters of color than he did in 2016, which really seems to go against the grain of the common sense, rather. It goes against the common sense that the Trump coalition is basically whites versus everyone else. It does seem like there's something more complicated going on, and I also wonder, as you put out there, Ethan, how much of it is really just nihilism, that people simply no longer see any correlation between their material reality and the politics in office. And I don't think it's difficult to explain something like his really good showing among Latino voters in Texas with anything else. That clearly, or apparently, voters no longer feel like they can express their interest at the ballot box. But there's something else in this whole equation that I think also needs to be spoken about, because regardless of the nihilism, regardless of right-wing voters voting for right-wing politics, which are all things that are going on in the election, it nevertheless remains the case that Joe Biden so far has won several million more votes than Donald Trump, and no matter how many votes are left to be counted, it looks pretty clear that Joe Biden will actually win a majority of the votes cast, whether he wins the election or not. And that raises the question of the Electoral College, a anachronistic system for electing the president that the United States has had in effect for over 150 years, unchanged since the end of the Civil War in 1865. And should Trump manage to win this time, this would represent the third time in only 20 years that a Democratic candidate has won the popular vote and lost the election to the Republicans. So I guess to both of you, the question, how can it be that such a system continues to operate in what considers itself, at least, the world's greatest democracy? And why hasn't the party that has now been disadvantaged by this system 3 times in 20 years not done anything about it?
Okay. Well, so there's a lot in that. Maybe, I don't know, Nicole, do you want to, maybe I'll touch on the race and demographics piece of the question, and then you take on the Electoral College a little bit, or what would you say?
I think on the question of why the Democratic Party is not interested in, eliminating the Electoral College, I do think it is because it very much serves their interest to have the Electoral College. Let's say there is a constitutional change, by the way, that I would think we would need, as we are seeing in Chile, with massive mobilizations to happen. If that ever happened here in the US, and there is the real possibility of eliminating the Electoral College, then for the Democratic Party, there is a real chance that they will not be elected because they do not represent the material interests, as we were talking, of working people here in the US. So, and we would know that there would be a third alternative growing very fast and probably winning an election. So I think it serves both parties. It serves the Republicans and the Democrats. And it seems like they prefer to lose a campaign than actually change the system, right?
Yeah, and I'll just add for that to do a very quick sort of Electoral College for dummies. It's been around for a really long time. It sort of was put into place by the founding fathers of the country. It was a sort of compromise. At that time, there was nobody in the world anywhere who was actually directly electing officials. So it was seen as too scary to take that large step. This was the compromise that emerged. And very important to that, intertwined with that, is what is known as the 3/5 Compromise in the United States, which essentially was a compromise by which Black people, slaves, were counted as 3/5 of one person, which was the electoral math that ensured a political balance between different regions, slaveholding and non-slaveholding regions of the country. So this anti-democratic system was put into place actually explicitly to count Black people in the United States as less than a full person, as 3/5 of a person. And it still does that to this day. If we look at, for example, states like Wyoming, where each electoral delegate has behind them around 200,000 voters, versus California, where each has behind them around 800,000 voters. This means that each person's vote is counting, approximately 4 times less in terms of the number of delegates that they are electing. So we're seeing incredible inequities between more populated, more urban states and more rural states. I would agree with what Nicole would say. I would just add that it's also quite, it is relatively difficult to change. Certainly Biden, in the lead up to the campaign, was talking about changing this and talking about other electoral reforms. I'm not sure if that was genuine or not, but it's very clear that he will not have a strong enough mandate. He will probably also not have control of the Senate, and so it will once again be pushed off. Very quickly connecting to this demographic point, I think it's sort of responding to your question. I think it's yes, and I would say that certainly if we look across the exit polling so far, the only demographic where Trump did worse than he did in 2016 was amongst white men, where his vote total dropped from 62 to 57%. Still 57% there. He did better with white women, from 52 to 54%, and better right across the board, even with his lowest vote total, which was Black women, where it rose from 4 to 8%. Again, this is early exit polling, but that's where we're at right now. So of course, I think when we look at the Electoral College, we look at the fact that whites in America are convincingly voting for Trump. We do have to look at white supremacy in the way that it is structurally embedded into the American political logic, the American electoral logic, and the minds of voters today. That said, I think that this fantasy that was started by Democrats in the 1990s, that there was a certain demographic inevitability by which America would become less and less white and we would have a generation of Democratic dominance, has been fully, at this point in time, destroyed. We do see Latinos increasingly turning to Donald Trump. And while there are a number of reasons for that, I don't want to go on too long right now. The last thing that I will say is that Latinos during the Democratic primary were convincingly voting in favor of Bernie Sanders over Joe Biden, presumably because they were in favor of the policy package that he was putting forward, the way that he would meaningfully impact their lives. And again, we saw a very sort of content-free campaign run by Biden, and here is the result.
So, I mean, even it's still like days before we know who is the winner of the election, we know definitely that the squad, like AOC, Yana Presley, Rashida Tlaib, and also Ilhan Omar were re-elected, and that's some good news. And Cory Bush also was elected. So there are some pockets where socialist messages still can win. So I'm wondering why, or how can we explain this discrepancy? Is it like urban-rural divide or old vs young? How do you explain that? So my question is to both of you, Ethan and Nicole. How would you explain this to the audience?
I would say that, at least from the short experience that I've had here in the US, there is a great popularity for different campaigns that obviously would have a positive effect on, the material lives of especially of young people, especially since young people here don't have very good perspectives, and even more now with the COVID crisis coming, that, for example, Medicare for all or even a free education would mean a great, a great relief for many who live in debt here in the US, right? So I think there is obviously, we are seeing like an increment of interest in leftist campaigns and in socialist ideas, as I would say, even as a third way of engaging in politics. And I think it's actually more than natural to have this development. It took a while in the US, but it's more than natural to have this development, especially if it's a nation where you only have two options, which are basically conservative, ruling class, and then you have liberal ruling class, and they don't really offer any perspectives beyond any cultural, wars that they're having between themselves. So I do think that's the space that at least the SA is trying to capture right now, and I think it's doing very well. As you said, we won, Cory Bush from Missouri. We won also Jamal Bowman from New York. He's also a congressman now. We got those news yesterday. And we got also all, at least for us, from people who are in New York, it's very important. We also won 5 legislators in New York State, right? We won Julia Salazar as a Senate, Brisport, and Sora Mamdani, Farah. So we won several people that were represented us in the state legislator, I think you call it here in the US, right? Which is basically like the bicameral legislator, but on a state level. And that has been also great news for us, especially for those that are having now more statewide campaigns. So I would say, obviously, besides the national disappointment, we are winning small battles in different states. And that is a little bit, as I would say, like a beam of hope for us, that it represents that there are people who are being, who are being attracted to what we want to offer as a socialist organization.
Yeah, I'll just add to that quickly. We in DSA, up to this point, we've won 19 of the 22 endorsements that we made going into this election. That's an overwhelming a rate of success. We've got, as Nicole said, 4 people now in the U.S. Congress. Progressive politics, really truly left progressive politics, when put on offer, we're chosen more often than not yesterday. I think that more than being an urban-rural divide, I think there's some truth to that, but I think that more important, we're looking at a divide, a generational divide, a youth revolt. And I would also, it pains me to say it, but if I look back 7-8 months, just before the dual cataclysm of Super Tuesday and the outset of the coronavirus, we were not that far away from instead having Bernie Sanders as the candidate here. And I still firmly believe, while I do not think that Bernie would have won goes far enough to explain the situation, I still firmly believe that Bernie would have won this election and would have won it more convincingly than Biden did, by precisely winning over some of these people in Florida who voted to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, but voted for Trump. So I think that it's something that's there, that's sort of waiting to move into the center in United States politics. And of course, the Democratic Party has been doing everything that it possibly can to marginalize and shut that out. Sadly, probably more if we look at their ruthlessness than they did, for example, to prevent the most recent Supreme Court nomination.
Yeah, I'm also thinking of the election results, like either way, either it's Trump or Biden, the Black Lives Matter mobilizations don't seem to have made much of a dent on it. So where do you think that movement can and should go in the future?
I think I think it's a difficult question, but I do think it made a dent on young people. Most young people voted for Biden, right? And as we saw, some of the statistics said, why are Democrats voting for Biden? The highest option was because he's not Trump, right? It's not because he represents something. So I would say that young people that probably were, participant of the big demonstrations that we had this year, were voting for Biden just as a no vote for Trump. And we do have, we even have a DSA member who was, a Ferguson activist who won now the Congress, right? So I do think obviously these movements take years to develop. BLM has some issues in like how it is starting to accommodate and to structure itself into an organization. And I think also the debate whether it is more independent of the Democratic Party or not is, I would guess, also a debate that's happening, especially I would guess between younger Black activists and older Black activists, right? So I do think that it is a movement that will have more influence in the future, sadly, because we know the racist police in the US is not going to stop shooting Black men in the streets. So we are going to see, I think, a rise in this movement and in these demonstrations. And I would hope that that's what's going to cause a direct confrontation and cultural change in the US that's anti-racist, right?
Yeah, I would just, merely add to that sort of paraphrasing Rosa Luxemburg for this audience, that when we look at wide-scale change, we always see a dialectic between spontaneity and organization. And I think that these were largely spontaneous, mass-scale uprisings that had behind them lots and lots and lots of hard organization, as we see with people like Cori Bush, who will now be going to Washington, D.C. But to get to there were 30 million people out on the streets over the summer. It was, by some counts, the largest social movement or mass uprising in US history. This was very spontaneous, and you always see these periods of alternates. And so I think oftentimes another thing, something that Frances Fox Piven is always fond of saying, is that every social movement in all of human history that we've measured has appeared to disappear before it's ultimately succeeded. So I think if we look at it in too much of a positivist way, like where is the change in terms of policy implementation immediately? It's not the way that social movements work. This was much more a period about raising consciousness, which I do believe that it's done, putting police violence against Black men and women, people of color, more squarely into the center of national consciousness, which I think that it very much did. And so I still believe that the long arc of justice there is bending towards justice. But this takes time, particularly in a climate like this, where we do have Donald Trump as the president, sort of dog whistling or dog trumpets, blaring out to racists in the country and blaring out for his ultra partisans to go out into the street with their guns. This, of course, makes it a very difficult context in which to realize policy, progressive policy reform, criminal justice reform. But I do believe it's moving in that direction.
Speaking of dialectics, maybe the dialectic of change, dialectic of enlightenment, Ethan, one strange contradiction that we can maybe understand in dialectical terms that I'm still trying to wrap my head around is the passage of Prop 22 in California yesterday. So for viewers who don't know, Prop 22 was a ballot proposition put forward by largely Silicon Valley capitalists to allow Uber and Lyft, the rideshare companies, to continue to classify, or rather return to classifying their workers as contractors. This basically allows them to save lots of money on small details like health insurance, unemployment protection, all of the benefits, or what meager benefits American workers do receive in the anemic American welfare state, have now been, by popular majority, revoked once again to the benefit of major Silicon Valley companies, specifically Uber and Lyft. Now, this is happening in California. California is a state that everyone calls liberal, maybe even socialist. Whenever something particularly bad seems to happen in Trump's America, liberals in California will make jokes about seceding from the union. Sometimes I think some of them are even serious. But how dialectically, Ethan, can we understand this? That what is supposedly the most progressive, the most left-wing state in the Union, and very much a Biden state, very heavily Democratic state, has now voted by a popular majority to take rights away from these workers and give even more money to Silicon Valley capitalists. What does that say about the Biden coalition, that these seemingly contradictory ideas, I mean, you brought up the Florida example, which I think is a great example that goes in the other direction, of Trump supporters getting behind a pretty great social welfare measure. But how do we understand this? I mean, what does that tell us about, is it just California? Or is it something about the liberal elite that constitutes a large chunk of Biden's sort of natural base?
Yeah, I mean, one thing, I do think that we have to say that the prop political culture is a very particular culture of political referendums in California that has a long history and which has a long history of producing contradictory results. It's essentially very open to intense lobbying efforts and mobilization. So we have a long history of California producing seemingly contradictory political results. So that has to be said. That said, I do think that it represents the other side of the coin of the Florida example, which is essentially that Joe Biden has not run a campaign by and for the working classes. He has not put together a class-based coalition. It is a special interest coalition that is welded to a never Trump coalition and has around its edges a few people who are barely welcomed into the coalition, who sort of hold their noses on election day but aren't particularly excited about Biden. So in that regard, I don't view it as contradictory at all, because I unfortunately have to say that I do not see the Biden coalition and vote as being particularly one of and for the working classes, which obviously the passage of this undermines. I would rather see this vote as being driven by never Trumpers in large urban areas in the Bay Area and in Los Angeles who want to ensure that they get cheap Uber fare on their way home from bars and parties and whatever might be the case. And then lastly, I'll just say that it's in a much broader climate of attacks on labor, which have been deepened throughout the Trump administration, which go back since before the Trump administration. And which will continue. One interesting and I think really scary statistic here is that it would appear that 40% of union members voted for Donald Trump, which is the same percentage as in 2016. If we look at that, sort of take a simple analysis of that, we have to say that our existing unions have done basically nothing to politicize their struggles and politicize their union members in such a way that would in any way influence how they vote over the last 4 years. So that's something that's really concerning for me in the context of what we've seen, the attacks on labor during the Trump administration. And it leads to these sorts of votes which are divorced from working class and labor realities.
Yeah, you are both in the DSA, and I'm wondering, and the DSA is the most inspiring thing that come out of Trump's election. Where you think the left can go from here, or the DSA can go from here, and how can the left fight, and also how to resist the slide into despair? I guess to both of you.
Well, I think the DSA has had huge success. We are, I think now at 75,000, maybe 80,000 already members. Are we something like that, Ethan?
Yeah, we're right around 80 now. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have been growing every time. I realized every time something important happened, we got more members. Like, for example, interesting. Our chapter in Syracuse is the fastest growing chapter in the US for some reason. We must be doing something right. So for example, when Bernie basically was not allowed to become a candidate, that's when we got a huge wave of people coming in. When COVID started, that's what we got a huge wave. I would suppose if Trump wins, we will get another one. I hope if Biden wins, we will get another wave of people coming in. And the huge success of the DSA is because it has used that strategy of, the ballot line strategy, basically endorsing or having their own members become candidates in specific to specific seats where they can actually win, and that by winning those positions, they are able to basically popularize socialist ideas into the mainstream, which is something that in the US, doesn't generally happen because especially media is very much, very conservative. So that's have been one of the huge successes. And the DSA has said in their convention last year that they will continue with that strategy, that will continue endorsing candidates that call themselves socialists and that are willing to bring forward our working class organization and socialist ideas into the mainstream, which is something that we saw with AOC, certainly. And I hope we're going to see more with Cory Bush and Jamal Bowman right now. So that's certainly one of the big things that DSA is doing correctly. The other thing is obviously that we stand for all those campaigns that have great popularity, right? Medicare for All, Green New Deal, especially popular between young people. We have other campaigns right now, especially regarding COVID, right? We have a campaign of COVID Safe Together, working with the United Electrical Workers. We have been involved in the anti-racist struggles that happened with the BLM protests here this year. And we are also having now a campaign to save the postal service here in the US, which is under attack basically to become privatized, right? So that's something, all of those, working class struggles and also anti-racist struggles is where we have been involved. And hopefully with the new folks that we have won into their seats, we're gonna be able to bring those debates even deeper into this society and at some point, hopefully create a strong discontent so that we can actually win these campaigns and actually change the US.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of optimism, I would only add to that it's again, I think it was clear even before this election that the politics of the Democratic Party are exhausted. They are not working anymore. They have not been working for some time. I think that probably the preternatural political skills of Barack Obama kept them alive single-handedly after they were already exhausted and prevented a lot of us and a lot of folks from seeing the extent to which the Democratic Party had become divorced from any sort of mass base, any sort of mass working class base. We continue to see that problem manifest in support for Trump, including in this election just now. And Nicole went over it really well. I mean, we stand for a whole lot of things that on issue after issue, people agree with. People want this sort of change. The Democratic Party is not bringing it right now. And I really do believe that it's sort of a moment of socialism or barbarism, socialism or Trumpism, that the liberal model just is not actually adequate to match and meet up to and contest and win people over in the way that's needed in this moment in history. So, I mean, that's cautiously optimistic, but I do believe I believe that that's the way that we need to go forward.
Can I just add something? Because I had the experience of being, I lived for several years in Germany and I was active there. I lived also in Chile like 2 years ago, and I have to say that in being active now in the US, this is like, I'm amazed at how, although it's nationally looking very, bad, I'm amazed at how the socialist movement here is growing so fast and so well. And that's actually, for me as an activist, long socialist activist, a very positive thing. And that I think sometimes the activists here in the US don't realize it, that how well they're doing, right? Like that it's growing, and you're actually, in the other countries, you see the opposite effect, right? Actually, the left is losing, right? So although obviously nationally we have we are not in a very good foot, I would say, but as an organization, we're doing quite well.
Thanks to both of you. We're almost out of time, but I did want to ask one last question related to DSA. I think one thing that we haven't really talked about, that no one's talking about, but that itself speaks for the political situation in the States, is that third-party candidacies have played no role. They're not being blamed as election spoilers, but they're also not being discussed as a real alternative. I mean, Howie Hawkins, the candidate for president for the Green Party, is not in the discussion the same way that Jill Stein was maybe in 2016, and more than anything, the way that Ralph Nader was in 2000. And that seems to reflect a broader development or lesson that's been learned since 2015, namely that the biggest audiences for socialist ideas in generations in the United States emerged not from without, but from within the Democratic Party. That operating within that structure seems, for better or for worse, to have created or tapped into an audience for socialist ideas that was never reached through any of the various well-intentioned third-party initiatives of the last decades. So I guess going forward, and we can wrap it up with that, let's say we assume that Joe Biden wins. But either way, regardless of who's the president, do you see the Democratic Party, or at least the Democratic ballot line, as the place where DSA and perhaps socialist politics more generally will develop in the U.S. in the years to come?
Ethan, would you like to go, or?
No, you go ahead.
Yeah. So I do think that the question on our strategy, so far, obviously, it has been to use the ballot line. I think it's still open within the organization. There's still a debate on how that will turn out, right? Whether there might be some people that say we can actually reform the Democratic Party, and there are others that say we actually can't, and we are just using the ballot line to, at some point where we're strong enough, we can, break from them. So that's, I think, an open question still. But I do think that, and especially regarding how to maintain our independence as an organization, right? Because we don't, what we certainly don't want is for our effort to go into the democratic structure, right? What we want is to grow our own organization as a socialist organization. But I do think that if Biden is the winner, we would certainly, I would guess, still use the ballot line strategy and basically create more of a division within the Democratic Party that is clear enough that there's some candidates within it and a wing that's actually socialist, and then there's the other one that does not represent working class interests. So I do think that it has been successful so far, and I don't see how it would not be if we continue with that strategy.
Yeah, I'll just add that we, a huge piece of, I totally agree with everything Nicole said about the success of our strategy to this point. And the piece that we haven't been talking about so much today, for obvious reasons, is just how much of our work is happening completely outside of the electoral sphere. And this is something that's beautiful about DSA. We have thousands and thousands of members that don't care about electoral politics all that much, that are getting involved in climate politics and racial justice politics, in labor organizing, all sorts of different things, and that are doing it on the streets, that are doing it with trade unions, that are doing it with racial justice groups. And I would go a bit further even and say that perhaps it's one of the reasons why we've seen this broader shift away from third-party candidates. What we saw with the Green Party, all due respect to Howie Hawkins, they run in elections and they don't do a whole lot else in between them. We, on the other hand, are doing all kinds of stuff all of the time. And I think that it allows for sort of a recalibration, and I would say maturation of people's politics, where people don't just express their politics in the ballot box once every 4 years. They're able to find expression for radical politics in the streets, in trade unions, all over the place, all of the time, which leads to sort of a deepening of one's relationship with political identity and relativizes the space of what it means when you do go into the ballot box once every so many years. So for the moment, I don't see any reason for us to change. As Nicole said, it is a tension within the organization, but I think tensions within organizations can be good, and they can drive forward. Speaking dialectically, they can drive forward progress, and I think that's been the case up to this point. So we can never predict what the future will hold, but for now, I think that tension around this question, and also the tension inside sort of electoral politics versus outside of electoral politics has really spurred us forward and done so in a really productive and successful way.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have today. I want to thank both of our guests, Nicole Mueller-Gonzalez as well as Ethan Earle, for taking the time to talk to us today. And obviously, we are crossing our fingers for them and for the Democratic Socialists of America and for everybody in the United States that the lesser of the two evils pulls through today. But like Ethan said, we can't predict the future unless the winner's been declared in the last 45 minutes. I've not been checking the news. I'm pretty sure we're still going to have a couple days or even a couple more weeks until we know who definitively won this election. But even if we can't predict the future, I think something all of us can agree on, Democrat or Republican, American citizen or non-citizen, voter or non-voter, no matter what happens tomorrow and the day after, one thing we all know is that Bernie would have won. Thanks a lot for joining us. We'll be back in 2 weeks on Wednesday, November 18th, talking about the agriculture, or the Alliance for an Agricultural Revolution in Africa, a Gates Foundation funded initiative that has done quite a lot to hurt small and medium-sized farmers on the continent. We'll be welcoming several authors of a study that the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung financed on the project. Until then, best of luck to everybody in the United States, and see you next time.
Take care. Thanks a bunch.
Thank you.